San Antonio, Texas, is a city that is home to the Spurs, the United States Air Force, and the famous historical landmark, the Alamo. While San Antonio is famous for its Spanish American Western history, there is more than meets the eye of the city when examining its untouched history. Deep within the depths of San Antonio lays a multitude of forgotten history that has been intentionally hidden from the public until now. I am your host, Streetlight Historian, and together we will explore the hidden histories of San Antonio, Texas. Aerospace medicine is defined as a medical field that focuses on maintaining the health, safety, and performances of pilots and astronauts in both military and civilian fields. The challenges that many flight surgeons face today are space exploration issues. One of the main issues they face is how humans can successfully live on a different planet without experiencing any health risk that could be potentially fatal. What makes aerospace medicine different from the other fields of medicines is that it is the only medical field that focuses on space exploration. Using preventive medicine, flight surgeons medically examine and treat both pilots and astronauts who are experiencing health problems related to their air and space travel. Besides taking care of pilots and astronauts, flight surgeons also play a role in public health and help medically treat civilian communities that are near the military bases they are stationed at. San Antonio civilians were excited that their city was playing a role in space exploration during the 1950s, when the School of Aviation Medicine began promoting its research to the public. There was a San Antonio High School club called the San Antonio Society for Space Travel that was created to encourage the young San Antonio generation to consider the possibility of working in the STEM fields that focused on space exploration. The San Antonio Society for Space Travel was even allowed to come to the School of Aviation Medicine symposium and meet with some of the leaders in the space medicine field. By the 1960s, the school had made San Antonio, Texas an international household name when President John F. Kennedy gave his speech at Brooks Air Force Base on November 21, 1963, the day before his assassination. This was the president's last speech before going to Dallas, and in his speech he proclaimed that the school made the city of San Antonio, Texas, the gateway to space exploration. It had revolutionized space travel and ultimately unlocked the mysteries of space. While Sam had become the shining jewel for San Antonio, Texas, there was a dark underbelly of the city. Like Phoenix, Arizona, San Antonio was a metropolitan frontier that promoted the ideals of an urban oasis within the agricultural landscape of Texas from the 1940s to the 1990s. From these ideals, San Antonio had created segregated boundaries that negatively impacted racial minorities while giving white Americans more advantages within the city. San Antonio's oligarchies from the 1940s to the 1970s sought the construction of home and economic developments in the north side that excluded racial minorities that were not white. The oligarchies had created an urban regime focused on economics and society that reinforced tourism as the basis of the economy, giving them complete control of the city for 30 years. This led to redlining districting, where the Latin American population was put on the west side of San Antonio, African Americans on the east side of San Antonio, Anglo-Saxon Americans on the northern side of San Antonio. This created racial tensions between white communities and non-white communities within San Antonio, Texas. The oligarchies made sure that no racial minorities had any influence in San Antonio politics from the 1940s to the 1970s, for fear that many of them would overthrow them and desegregate San Antonio. Everything began to change when the city's civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s began to fight back against the oligarchies. Under the leadership of Henry B. Gonzalez and other civil rights leaders in San Antonio, they were able to win a couple of civil rights cases that ended San Antonio segregation's laws. This caused the oligarchies to lose their powers by the 1970s and were replaced by political leaders that represented their communities and fought for civil rights. By the 1980s, San Antonio was desegregated and many of its communities were able to rebuild and create better connections with each other. During San Antonio's segregation era, while the oligarchies had control over the city, the School of Aviation Medicine was not under their influence. Under the leadership of the United States Air Force, the school was one of the most progressive institutions in San Antonio, Texas that believed in desegregation. From the 1950s, it allowed integrated classrooms where foreign medical students studied with American medical students. The school not only focused on military communities, but it also focused on civilian communities as well. The school made countless medical contributions to San Antonio, Texas, with its medical research and engineering. One of the most prominent research projects that the school conducted was the Cardiovascular Disease Research Project. The school's Health Evaluation and Risk Tabulation, also known as HEART program, developed new preventive health dietary programs to treat cardiovascular disease for both military and civilian communities. This research helped many Latin American communities in San Antonio, since cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in Latin American communities. This caught the attention of San Antonio's oligarchies, who saw the United States military as a threat to their segregation laws. Unknown to most civilians, the San Antonio oligarchies waged a covert economic warfare campaign against the United States military from the 1950s to the 1960s, in hopes of kicking out their economic influence in San Antonio, Texas. The 1968 hemisphere was the oligarchies' master plans of taking away the United States military influence, in hopes that the city council would invest more on tourism rather than the United States military. Their plan backfired, however, when they learned that the hemisphere not only increased the United States military influence in San Antonio's economy, but also brought in more international companies into San Antonio's economy that believed in desegregation as well. With the growing influence of the United States military, international companies, and civil rights organizations, led to the eventual fall of San Antonio's oligarchies by the 1970s. By the end of the 2000s, the San Antonio Society began to shift its position on promoting the school's history. Once the school and Hangar 9 Aerospace Medicine Museum was permanently closed in 2011, San Antonio stopped all discussion on the history of the school. It became evident that the San Antonio Society of the 2010s did not want their history of the School of Aerospace Medicine to be known, after making no mentions of it in the city's 300th anniversary celebration in 2018. The reasoning behind this covert campaign to keep the school out of the public eye was that the school had some controversial historical figures that were recently uncovered in the 1990s. The School of Aviation Medicine, also known as SAM, was founded in the year 1918 in Long Island, New York. The tasks that the school faced were to help the United States government achieve air superiority through the use of medicine. SAM not only became the first medical school that focused on aviation medicine, but it was also the first Air Force military institution in the United States. By 1926, SAM needed more property after outgrowing its base in Long Island, and chose San Antonio, Texas as the best candidate for SAM's new home.
Well, the decision, as far as the aviation side is concerned, came from then Lieutenant Benjamin Floyd. And as I like to call him, the American aviator, he originally showed up in San Antonio with the only aircraft, a Wright flyer, that the Army had. And why he came here, I'm still a little fuzzy, but he went to Fort Sam Houston, and that's where he learned to fly and trained other mechanics to fix the plane and other pilots, up to and including George Kelly. Now, it was also the reason why he left Fort Sam when George crashed and killed himself, and the base commander kicked everybody off the base at that point. Falloy received orders to re-engage this activity a few years later because it looked as if we were getting into World War I. And so he thought of no better place other than to come back to San Antonio. The weather is almost ideal as far as you have very few really bad weather months per se, as opposed to College Park, Maryland, or Fort Myers, Virginia, where your rainy, heavy wind days wasn't really conducive for something as light as a Wright flyer to fly in. So coming down here, slightly more stable weather, I think, was a big thing for him. And since he was familiar with the city, it was easy enough to come back. So starting off here, we had Fort Sam, then of course Kelly Field opened up for aviators, and we started training enlisted airmen not long after that as well, right here.
School of Aviation Medicine started at Minneota, Long Island, New York, on what was known as Hazelhurst Field, which later became Roosevelt Field, same field that Charles Lindbergh took off in 1927. So the concept of a flight surgeon was formed by the Air Force's first school, and they wanted to evaluate pilot candidates physiologically and psychologically for fitness for flying. So in 1926, they decided to move to San Antonio, because that's where all the flying was being conducted. Brooks Field was the primary flight school, and Kelly Field, which is nearby in San Antonio, was the advanced flight training school. So the School of Aviation Medicine moved to San Antonio, to Brooks Field in 1926, where to evaluate the pilots that are flying here in San Antonio. By the way, the Army Air Corps had consolidated most of its flying training during the 1920s in San Antonio at the two fields, Brooks and Kelly Field.
From 1926 to 2011, Sam became a shining gem for the city of San Antonio, Texas, for the school had helped humanity advance in medicine, technology, and to a certain extent, philosophically.
Now we go into the social economic side of it, and it was just phenomenal. And looking at the economic side was a huge boon, a very good thing for the city of San Antonio. So we had a huge influx of Army personnel coming through Fort Sam Houston. And that number's probably increased in, say, the past 20 years or so. But just with the formation of Kelly Field, that came about in 1917, and then Brooks Field started a few years after that, Randolph in 1929, and then the Johnny-come-latelys, as I like to call it, Lackland in 1941. The development of all of these bases spurred on an economic boon for the city of San Antonio because, there were jobs to be had, for starters. And then not only jobs to be had on the bases, but we had all of these young people in the military coming through and requiring services, not just food, but laundry services, entertainment, and the like. So it was a very big deal, and I'm happy to say that the city of San Antonio, I'll say since the formation of Kelly Field, and quite literally, it was even with Fort Sam Houston, the citizens of San Antonio have had a bit of a love affair with the military. Calling this military city USA is absolutely pinpoint accurate. On the social side, a really big mix, an international city, and mainly because of the international flavor of our training, probably more so now than in the past, where we have a lot of our partner nations, military nations, coming through and training in all aspects here. The Turks were here. The Air Force pilots from Turkey were here to learn how to speak English and to fly. They were one of the first ones. And let me not discount the Mexican Air Force, people from Mexico and the like, that came through here as well to train. But that type of international flavor and more national flavor, because with all of the military coming through San Antonio, they were coming from every corner of the country and training here, working here, living here, moving on. made the city of San Antonio a very diverse one. So both on the economic and social side, it was an incredible piece. San Antonio would not be today. If you took away all those bases, yeah, you could take away, I don't know, 9 of the 10 traffic lights we have. I jest, but that's the general idea.
The School of Aviation Medicine, which became School of Aerospace Medicine, was the kind of ground zero for the helping in the beginning of the spaceflight program for NASA. And so it was a big boon in terms of the scientists that were coming to work at San Antonio, who were experts in their fields, aerospace medicine, and space medicine. So it had a big economic boom in the city of San Antonio, and also the surrounding communities, Converse and Cibolo shirts. Because most of the scientists that were working at the school at Randolph Air Force Base and later at Brooks lived in these communities. So it had a very big economic impact because of the influx of engineers, scientists, and technicians. Besides the initial cadre of German scientists who were brought over during Operation Paperclip, other scientists came to work at not just the School of Aerospace Medicine, but the super laboratories, or the Armstrong Laboratory, which helped support the manned space flight program for the next 30 years. So beginning in 1959, when the school moved from Randolph to Brooks Air Force Base, through the next 30, 40 years, this was really the center of space medicine research. Most of the support to NASA, which had been formed in 1958, as the world's first floating space agency, was being under contract with the United States Air Force. Most of that work has been done here. Some of the work was done at Holloman and Air Force Base in New Mexico, and some in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. But the majority of it was being done at right here in San Antonio. And John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, came here in '63 to dedicate the series of buildings, the Aerospace Medical Complex at Brooks. This is November 21st, 1963. He thought it very important that he would dedicate, because that's where he gave credit to the Air Force contributions to the space program in his famous cap over the wall speech on November 21st, 1963. Unfortunately, 21 hours later, he went to Dallas and was assassinated. But he thought it was very important during his Texas swing to various cities. He came to Brooks to recognize the contributions of the Air Force scientists and that's definitely the economic impact to the city of San Antonio, because of the various contracts that the Air Force was getting from NASA. And NASA was right down the road in the Johnson Space Center in Houston. So quite a bit of partnership between the space agency and the Air Force in San Antonio. So it was a big boon for the city of San Antonio.
By 2011, the school closed its doors to San Antonio, Texas, and relocated to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio.
So let's start off with Brooks. When the BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Commission, announced the closure of Brooks, it was significant historically, or military history side, because of the missions that were accomplished there. The aviation medicine, physiological training, all of that. And it was a huge piece of Air Force medical history that occurred on Brooks. That mission, in and of itself, picked up and moved to Ohio and moved to other places in the Air Force. But the overall impact against the city as a whole was not minimal, but it wasn't that all inspiring, because the base itself had been drawing down for a number of years. They lost their flying mission, I think, back in the 50s, for crying out loud. So it was a smaller footprint than Kelly. Now, when you look at Kelly, you're looking at a juggernaut. You're looking at an institution, and it's probably right for me to call Kelly an institution, a former institution, where there were mainly civilians who worked there. Yes, there were plenty of uniformed people there, but mainly civilians because of the work that was accomplished there. It was a depot. They saw pretty much every airframe the Air Force had from, we'll say from the 20s through their closure in the late 90s, actually when it closed in 2001, but every airframe came through there for major overhaul. And when I say that, they took all the bolts out, they took the wings off, the engines off, they cleaned everything and built it back up again. Well, that was mainly civilians that were doing that job. And when you look at Kelly, you're looking at a place where generations of San Antonians worked and made a great, maybe not so great, but made, a very acceptable middle class wage. And so when the announcement came for closing Kelly, you saw protests. You heard very angry people in the city of San Antonio. And it was one of the first things that I heard when I first got here. I had a gentleman that was really upset about the idea of Kelly closing because his great-great-grandfather worked there. His grandfather worked there. His father worked there. He felt as if he needed to work there as well. It was that emotional connection people of the city had with Kelly. Now, what happened with the major missions that were at Kelly at this point, the depot level work moved to other locations, to Oklahoma and to Georgia, as a matter of fact. But, that called for uprooting yourself and moving, and people were pretty much settled here. They never considered, the whole mission leaving. So a lot of people went and did other things at this point. Now, the city did they did what they had to do. So they took over a portion of Kelly Field, just like they did Brooks. So I think they called it Brooks City Base when it closed, and now Port San Antonio. I think it was SA. They had another name for it before, but now I think it's Port San Antonio. So the city has done quite a bit to reinvest opportunities there at Kelly, to regrow it. A number of large businesses, including Boeing and some freight companies, UPS, Evergreen, and the like. Of course, they're there. The flight line is joint use now between the city and the military, the Air Force. But there are clearly not as many jobs there now with the entity of Kelly Air Force Base going away. So thousands upon thousands of people had to reinvent themselves, find other jobs, because the depot work was gone at this point. It was major. It was huge. I don't think of anything that happened that was bigger in San Antonio with the closure of Kelly. Of course, if I think back, I'm probably going to think about the explosion in Medina in 1963. That was big. Of course, that was overshadowed by the assassination of President Kennedy about a month or so later. So, the only other big thing that happened was Kelly closing, and it rocked this city. The city has recovered. There's no doubt. We have recovered, but it was a very big thing for this city, for Kelly Air Force Base to close. So now we are left with the memories.
I had the honor and also the privilege of being invited to conduct the last ceremonies at Brooks Air Force Base before the school moved. Brooks Air Force Base was a BRAC base realignment closure facility, and all the Air Force contracts and also the Air Force agencies had to move out of Brooks. The School of Aerospace Medicine was one of the major ones. It actually it moved to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It had not ever been to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. It had been in San Antonio from 1926 till 2011, quite a long time. So I was there at some of the ceremonies. They invited me to be a guest speaker. I also was at some of the ceremonies for a lot of the retirements that took place, because many of the scientists, one of the things that I didn't really bring out in the documentary I produced for the Air Force called The Story of Brooks, is that a lot of the scientists refused to move to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. A lot of them were involved in high altitude research for the Air Force, and they decided to retire. And so that had a big impact. And one of the things that affected the research later on was the joint fighter, the joint F-35, which has had a lot of problems. And one of the big problems was the onboard oxygen system. And all that high altitude research and development of those systems were being done at Brooks with the School of Aerospace Medicine. And a lot of those experts had already retired. And so there was no one to rely on in terms of the research when problems arose 30 years later, when the Joint Strike Fighter was being developed and fielded. But it was a big big impact is, in terms of many of the employees of School of Aerospace Medicine either retired, some of them moved to Wright-Patt Air Force Base and then retired when they got there. So a great loss of intellectual capital, the expertise in the various fields of study, especially in the area of vaccine development, epidemiology laboratories with the School of Aerospace Medicine, working with the World Health Organization. A lot of the people I knew that retired. So by having the school move, because the base was being closed as a result of the Base Realignment Closure Commission decision, had an impact in the near term for the Air Force in terms of losing the people that they needed to continue the research.
As of 2021, SAM has made Dayton, Ohio its official home and has continued its research in the field of aerospace medicine. In this episode, I will reveal the fascinating history of immigrant professors, international employees, and foreign medical students of SAM that changed the world that we see today. I will also reveal why the history has been hidden from the public of San Antonio since SAM left the city in 2011. To understand why this history has been hidden from the public, the first thing that should be discussed is the mysterious history behind the immigrant professors who had taught at SAM. By around the late 1940s, the School of Aviation Medicine began promoting the ideas of space exploration. When the school began seeking new opportunities to grow and expand its field around 1947, the idea of space exploration was starting to become more accepted rather than rejected by military institutions. The first modern rocket to be recorded in history was when American physicist Robert H. Goddard launched the first liquid rocket in 1926. During World War II, German engineers were able to create a larger and deadlier rocket known as the V-2 rocket. By the end of World War II, both the Allied powers and the USSR sought these German rocket scientists in hopes of having their own rocket weapon systems. Under the leadership of General Harry George Armstrong, the School of Aviation Medicine began opening its doors of employment to immigrants and foreigners. The reason behind this was that the School of Aviation Medicine was tasked to help the United States government find multiple medical solutions to a variety of problems that many military pilots faced when they traveled in the Earth's stratosphere and mesosphere during the late 1940s and early 1950s. Before the 1960s, these Earth's atmospheres were dangerous to fly in, for the oxygen layer was thin and caused the pilots to lose consciousness and crash. General Harry George Armstrong saw an opportunity to gather more data and knowledge of this issue when he learned that a couple of German medical doctors specialized in aviation medicine and aeronautics had been captured by the Allied forces at the end of World War II. It was decided that these German scientists and medical doctors were to be put under a government program known as Operation Paperclip. The program brought these German scientists and medical doctors to the United States and placed them under heavy watch while they did their scientific/medical research for the United States government. These Paperclip personnel helped Sam unlock the secrets to travel into the stratosphere and mesosphere. One Paperclip scientist, however, had bigger dreams of not only exploring these high altitudes, but also sought to unlock the mysteries of space exploration using medicine as the key. This path eventually led him to creating a new field that would make aviation medicine evolve into a new field known as space medicine. The man behind the creation of space medicine was Dr. Hubertus Struggold, who not only played a major role in the space race, but also left a legacy of controversy for Sam by the time after his death. Born on June 15, 1898, in Hamm, Germany, Dr. Hubertus Struggold was a German physiologist and medical researcher in the aviation medicine. From 1922 to 1935, he was a civilian medical doctor that worked for the Würzburg Physiology Institute as a professor. As a professor, he taught aviation medicine, the high-altitude environment, and human physiology to young medical students from the institute. In the year 1928, he was offered a one-year fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States. From that year, he traveled across the United States to visit multiple medical institutes that researched both human physiology and aviation medicine. After his fellowship had ended, he returned to Germany to continue his professorship at Würzburg Physiology Institute. A year later, he was offered a professorship at Friedrich Wilhelm University from 1928 to 1935. By working as a professor at Friedrich Wilhelm University, Dr. Hubertus Strughold became Germany's leading civilian expert in aviation medicine. In 1935, he was offered a position to become the leading head of a think tank project for Germany's Luftwaffe, also known as Air Force in English, called the Research Institute for Aviation Medicine, based in Berlin, Germany. Taking this position from 1935 to 1939, Dr. Strughold helped the Research Institute for Aviation Medicine go from being a think tank to becoming the most advanced medical civilian branch for Germany's Luftwaffe medical division by 1939. After Germany declared war in 1939, the Research Institute for Aviation Medicine was immediately taken into Germany's military and converted its civilian staff members into military officers. From 1940 to 1945, Dr. Strughold was a colonel in Germany's Luftwaffe and became one of the leading members for the new division called the Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine. The Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine was in many ways the German equivalent to SAM. The Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine sought to help Germany and the Axis powers conquer the skies in hopes to win both the European and Asian theater. Due to the Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine advancements in engineering and medicine, the institute was a force not to be reckoned with. During the first years of World War II, the German Luftwaffe had been successful with their aviation missions. This was due to the successful research that the Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine had produced. By the end of World War II, the Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine had been defeated, and Dr. Strughold had surrendered to the Allied forces in May of 1945. In October 1945, he came back as a professor in Germany and became the director of the Physiological Institute at Heidelberg, Germany, by the end of that year. From 1946 to 1947, he also worked for the United States Army Air Force and became chief scientist of the Aeromedical Center in the former Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Medical Research in Heidelberg, Germany. This caught the attention of the United States Air Force General Harry George Armstrong, who saw Dr. Strughold as a likely candidate for Operation Paperclip in hopes of bringing him into SAM. In 1947, Dr. Strughold arrived in San Antonio, Texas, and was stationed at Randolph Air Force Base with other Paperclip scientists. Nicknamed the German Colony, a dormitory in Randolph was used to house these Paperclip scientists that were living there from 1947 to 1952. Under the watchful eyes of the Department of Defense, or DoD for short, the Paperclip scientists began their professorships/research at SAM and became known as the Immigrant Professors. In 1948, it was at Randolph where Dr. Strughold coined the term space medicine to describe the field that would medically explore the possibilities of space exploration. From 1948 to 1968, not only did he stay as a professor at SAM, but he eventually became a leading faculty member of SAM in the early 1950s, a United States citizen in 1956, and was the chief scientist for NASA's Space Medicine Medical Division that played a vital role for the Apollo moon landing missions. Between 1948 to 1968, the professor helped SAM become the first medical institute to conduct research in atmospheric controls, the physical effects of weightlessness, disruption of normal time cycles, space cabin simulators, and the famous Mars jars that simulated the atmosphere of Mars. By 1968, he eventually retired from both NASA and SAM and lived the last remaining years in San Antonio, Texas. By September 25, 1986, at the age of 88, Dr. Strelcold passed away, leaving a legacy of being called the father of space medicine. Although his death marked the end of his life, it does not end his story, for it's revealed that a dark chapter of his life was kept hidden from the public until the 1990s. After his death, the United States Army Intelligence released a new declassified information on Operation Paperclip in the early 1990s. From these recent declassified materials, it was revealed that in 1945, Dr. Struggold was sought by the Allied forces as a war criminal for his alleged connections to the Dachau experiments. The Dachau experiments were programs that performed medical human experiments on prisoners from the Dachau concentration camp. These experiments include physiological tests that involve putting prisoners into freezing waters, place prisoners into air pressure chambers, and perform exploratory surgery on prisoners without using anesthesia. Most of these prisoners did not survive these experiments, and since the Air Force Institute of Aviation Medicine oversaw the Dachau medical experimentations, Dr. Struggold was seen as a potential suspect for these war crimes. Although there was not enough evidence to prove that Dr. Struggold was involved with the Dachau experiments, some of his subordinates and close associates were found guilty in the Nuremberg trials and were convicted of the crimes against humanity in connection with the Dachau experiments. After this information was revealed to the public, both the World Jewish Congress and the Anti-Defamation League requested the removal of all memorials and awards named after him during the 1990s. By 1995, Brooks Air Force Base removed Dr. Struggold's name from their Aeromedical Library and renamed it Brooks Aeromedical Library. He may have helped humanity achieve space exploration, but his involvement with the German military in World War II and his connections with the Dachau experiments leave a grim reminder that every academic field has a dark past. The only remnants of any historical notions to Dr. Struggold being here in San Antonio, Texas, is his headstone at an undisclosed location. Other notable paperclip scientists were stationed at Randolph Air Force Base from 1947 to 1952. While some paperclip scientists were medical doctors, others were either biologists or engineers. In this section, we will go over the other paperclip scientists who played a role in the space race that eventually led to the Apollo moon landing missions. Dr. Walter P. Schreiber was a former German general who spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of war in the Soviet Union and became a professor at SAM. He first served as a foot soldier in World War I and became a medical doctor in 1920 at Greifswald University. He became a general in 1942 and oversaw the German Department of Medical Science until the end of World War II. After the war, he escaped from the Soviet Union and was placed under watch by the Allied forces. By 1951, he was put under Operation Paperclip and was stationed at SAM to begin his research. However, by 1952, the United States Air Force was facing heavy criticism for allowing Dr. Schreiber to work at SAM when it was found that he was involved in the Nuremberg trials. From the growing criticism and backlash, he and his family left the United States by 1952. Dr. Conrad J. K. Buechner was a biophysicist that worked at SAM from 1947 to 1952. Born in Hanover, Germany, on October 6, 1903, Dr. Buechner studied physics and geophysics at the University of Erlangen-Hanover and Göttingen, taking his PhD degree at Göttingen in 1926. He later received the advanced degree of Doctor in Physiology at the University of Kiel, where he taught biophysics in the Institute of Bioclimatology for a few years. During World War II, he served as a section chief in the Aeromedical Institute at Rheinland, Germany, near Berlin. In 1947, along with several other German aeromedical specialists, Dr. Buechner signed a 5-year contract with the United States Air Force and was assigned to SAM. During this time at SAM, Dr. Buechner had done some notable work on radiation and related subjects. He began giving lectures at the University of California at Los Angeles. and once his contract had ended, Dr. Bunier left Sam in 1952 and became a full-time professor at UCLA. Mr. Roland Dornan was a German engineer who worked at SAM from 1958 to 1988. Born on October 1st, 1927, in Bammental, Germany, Mr. Dornan dreamed of becoming an engineer. He was given the opportunity to begin his education at the University of Heidelberg in 1941 at the age of 14. From 1941 to 1944, he was an apprentice engineer at the university's Physiology Institute, where he assisted the medical research in uncovering the secrets of weather physiology. By 1944, at the age of 17, he was drafted into the German army, wounded in the Czechoslovakia theater, and captured by the Soviet Union on the last day of World War II. After being held as a POW, he was let go and faced a difficult journey back to his home. From walking on foot for miles, going through drainage tunnels filled with human waste, and having to diplomatically talk with Russian guards on why they should spare his life, he was finally able to reach home. After reuniting with his family, he was able to get back into civilian life and complete his degree in engineering. From 1945 to 1955, he had worked 3 jobs in 3 different fields. One job was in the University of Mainz engineering department, the other one was in a zipper factory, and the last one was a telephone company. At the age of 28, the United States Air Force recruited him to work for the United States in the year 1955. After the Office of Special Investigations determined that he had no history of being a Nazi Party member, Mr. Dornan was given clearance to immigrate to the United States. He was the last person recruited in Operation Paperclip, earning the nickname the last Paperclip Scientist. After immigrating to the United States, he was stationed at SAM and stayed there from 1958 to 1988. Throughout these years, he began producing equipment that became critical for the United States space program from the 1950s to 1970s. He created several innovative life-saving devices, such as the pilot chemical defense equipment, the electronic stethoscope used by Vietnam War medics. In Mr. Dornan's personal life, he married his German sweetheart, Marini, when she arrived on a freighter at Brownsville, Texas in 1959. After retiring from SAM in 1988, he was offered a professorship at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He was credited to being the person who created the first machine shop for the engineering department at UTSA, which resulted in revolutionizing it. After being a professor for 5 years at UTSA, he officially retired and spent his last years with his family. At the age of 77 years old, Mr. Dornan passed away on April 26, 2005, and was the last living paperclip scientist to have worked at SAM. The leaders of SAM wanted to bring in international doctors and researchers from the Allied forces in hopes of expanding the field of space medicine throughout the entire world. After the end of World War II, SAM had made many connections with aviation medical doctors from around the world. The history of international employees who worked at SAM reveals that many of these employees helped the school not only in scientific research, but also in education, linguistics, and other positions. The first international employees that will be discussed are 2 linguistics who helped SAM translate volumes of medical research from German to English. Roland Johnson and Tamra von Johnson Babel were medical translators for SAM from 1949 to 1984. Their story begins in Russia during the most brutal times in Russian Revolution between 1917 and 1923. Born in 1889, Mr. Johnson was the son of Imperial Russian Artillery General Robert von Johnson and was related to a Russian Grand Duke who was the brother of Tsar Alexander III. Having a close relationship with Tsar, he always looked out and protected the Tsar. This eventually led him to have a close encounter with the infamous controversial Russian historical figure Georgy Rasputin. While on a train, he had an unforgettable encounter with Rasputin that left him shook for the rest of his life. He claimed that Rasputin hypnotized him just by looking at him in the eyes and claimed that he felt an unknown force controlling his body. After the encounter, he along with his friend Prince Felix Yusupov joined an assassination plot on Rasputin. Believing that the Tsar and his family were in danger from Rasputin, he was, he was the lookout while his friend dealt with Rasputin. They hoped that Rasputin would die by eating the pastries poisoned with arsenic, but for some unknown reason, Rasputin was not affected by the poison. He witnessed Rasputin escaping the scene, but was stopped by the assassins when Rasputin was shot in the head. Things became worse from there when the assassins found out that Rasputin was still alive. Rasputin was eventually thrown into the Malaya Nevyak River, and his body was found the next day. After examination, it was concluded that what killed Rasputin was not the poison or the gun wounds, but rather the drowning. The evidence revealed that Rasputin was alive and was trying to untie the ropes that bound him while underwater. After the death of Rasputin, Mr. de Johnson hoped that things for the Romanov family would eventually turn for the best. However, he did not anticipate the 1917 Russian Revolution that changed the lives of every Romanov forever. In the spring of 1917, he had sent his first wife and children to Finland to keep them safe. From that year, he hid his identity from the public and did humanitarian work to help former workers and their families stay alive under the new government. He was eventually caught by the People's Tribunal and placed in a pseudo-court that found him guilty for being a member of the Russian aristocracy. He was able to escape his execution when his friend and coachman Peter used a diversion tactic to rescue him. After escaping certain death, Peter transported him to the Finnish frontier where Mr. de Johnson took his last step in Russia and never returned to his homeland. In 1920, he remarried a woman named Kira and fathered a daughter named Tamara von Johnson-Babel. From 1920 to 1926, he had started a new life in Helsinki, Finland, as an owner of a private club and restaurant for artists. From time to time, he traveled along to the Finnish-Russian frontier to find out any news about what was happening inside the Soviet Union. It would be from these trips that Mr. de Johnson will learn that the Tsar and his family were all killed. He faced the fact that he could never return to his homeland, and his new family was now in danger of being targeted by the Soviet Union. He became an overprotective father to his daughter Tamara Babel, fearing that she would be kidnapped by the mysterious Soviet Union secret hitmen that were becoming notorious throughout the international world. Throughout his secret life in Finland, Tamara became his closest friend and confidant. It would be from here that Tamara would learn everything from her father and learn how to read and speak multiple languages. As life continued, he began to look for a new opportunity in hopes of creating a better future for his family. By 1926, he was offered a job to be a manager of a hotel and moved on that same year. He had hoped that by moving to Italy, it would have prevented his family from experiencing any more turmoil. However, since Italy was under the leadership of dictator Mussolini and his fascist party, the turmoil followed them to their new home. From 1926 to 1945, Mr. de Johnson and Tamara had to live through fascist Italy to German occupation of Italy. With his diplomatic skills and family history, he was able to save many lives who became easy targets for the Axis power. After World War II had ended, he saw that Italy was not the future for him and his family. In 1948, he and his family immigrated to the United States and began working in the United States as an Air Force civilian service in 1949. As a technical translator in the United States Air Force Civil Service, he worked at SAM to translate volumes of German medical research into English. In 1951, Tamara became a medical translator for SAM and worked with her father in helping him translate the German medical research. Eventually, Tamara became a foreign training officer in SAM's Office of Medical Translation. Besides translating medical research, Tamara and her father also worked on helping international students in learning aviation medicine by using their translation skills. It would be Mr. de Johnson who started the international program at SAM that enrolled countless numbers of foreign medical students. Throughout the 1950s and the early 1960s, their work helped SAM create strong ties with multiple international countries. They soon received the nickname Sam's Romanauts for their family's ties to the Romanov family. By 1964, Mr. de Johnson retired from SAM at the age of 75 and left his daughter in charge of the international programs. Tamara would continue her father's legacy throughout the 1960s and the 1980s before retiring from SAM in the year 1984. She lived a good life, was happily married, and had a child, had a couple of grandkids, and lived in San Antonio, Texas until her death on December 10th, 2008, at the age of 88. Royal Danish Air Force officer and medical doctor, and forgive me if I mispronounce his name here, Steen Schleisner Meyer, was a student at SAM in the fall semester of 1951. While studying the aviation medicine field, he learned that SAM was not teaching the Holger-Nielsen method of artificial respiration technique. The Holger-Nielsen method of artificial respiration was a method created by Danish Army officer Colonel Holger Nielsen, who happens to be Dr. Meyer's uncle. The creation of the Holger-Nielsen method happened after a tragic event took place that changed Colonel Nielsen's life forever. In 1920, Colonel Nielsen's son died from drowning in the Kattegat, a few miles north of the Kovenich. Although he was no doctor, he thought that a better method of artificial respiration might have saved his son's life. For 5 years, he studied physiology and was able to develop a resuscitation technique that was commonly taught in the 1950s. The volunteer who helped prove that his resuscitation technique worked was a 12-year-old Dr. Meyer. Learning that Sam was not teaching this technique, Dr. Meyer demonstrated how the Holger-Nielsen method of artificial respiration was a final method to saving pilots' lives when crashing into a water environment. Sam became impressed with this demonstration that the school offered him a position at SAM. After graduating from SAM, he would visit the school regularly to teach Holger-Nielsen method of artificial respiration to multiple students and become a consultant on artificial respiration for SAM. Dr. Alberto Hurtado was the director of the Andean Institute of Biology at the National University of San Marcos, Lima, Peru, the first and oldest university in the Americas. The Andean Institute of Biology is a medical research institute highly devoted to the study of the human body being affected in high-altitude environments. He was considered by many to be the top authority of high-altitude adaptation in the 20th century. Born on August 29, 1901 in Lima, Peru, he graduated from the Harvard Medical School in 1923 and had done a fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation in 1931. In 1935, he returned to Lima, Peru to help Peru's academia and continued his research in high-altitude environment. Although it was a bumpy road, he overcame the many challenges he faced and was able to create the Andean Institute of Biology. As director of the program, the Andean Institute of Biology became one of the most advanced medical research facilities in the South American continent. Located in Moraca, Peru, the Andean Institute of Biology was 14,900 feet above sea level. From this facility, he and his peers published in multiple medical journals and reports that helped advance the field of aviation medicine. At the age of 82, he passed away at his home in Lima, Peru. In the 1950s, he had not only become a SAM consultant in the field of high-altitude environment and human physiology, but also created a couple of programs that allowed SAM scientists to work with him at his Andean Institute of Biology in Peru. He also gave multiple lectures at SAM and did many of his research projects at SAM's medical facilities. Sam believed that for aviation medicine to expand across the world, they would have to teach it to those who lived in other parts of the world. With General Armstrong's approval, Sam began accepting more foreign students into their classes and even allowed integration in the classrooms. Under the leadership of Roland Dornan and Tamara von Johnson-Babel, SAM opened its doors to medical students from around the world. Some of these medical students came from NATO nations such as Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, and Turkey, neutral nations such as Spain, Mexico, Sweden, and Belgium, and even adversary nations such as the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and China. While some foreign medical students could speak and read English, others could not. To help with this problem, Roland Dornan, Tamara von Johnson-Babel, and other SAM linguistics helped these students both in translating their lectures and writing materials. With the help from SAM's linguistics, the foreign medical students were able to successfully complete their medical courses and become official medical flight surgeons. Foreign medical students also had the opportunity to participate at SAM's social events, symposiums, and special lectures. They also had an opportunity to tour San Antonio, participate in some of the city's festivities, and enjoy some of San Antonio's wide variety of entertainment. From the 1950s to the 1990s, the space medicine era had not only helped advance the field of aerospace medicine for SAM, but it also helped the school become more connected to the international world and spread the knowledge of aerospace medicine. After the space medicine age had ended in the 1990s, the number of international students coming to San Antonio, Texas decreased. By 2011, most of the international programs that were taught at SAM had been officially placed in Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. SAM's immigrant professors, international employees, and foreign medical students have played a vital role in San Antonio's history. From creating the space medicine field, making contributions to San Antonio's communities, to opening its doors to international communities, these historical figures had indeed reshaped San Antonio into the city that is seen today. While the hidden history of SAM had been uncovered, there is still more historical work that needs to be done. San Antonio still has a vast amount of hidden history that needs to be uncovered. Like any untouched or forgotten history, the truth is stranger than the fiction. I am your host, Streetlight Historian, and as always, enjoy the streetlight.